Nurse, come closer. I want to ask you something, and I am too old and too near the end to be ashamed of it. I am here, sir. Take your time. My own children came yesterday. Do you know why? Not to see me. To ask, through the door, whether I had signed the new papers yet, whether the lawyer had been. They think I did not hear them counting in the corridor. He stopped, and his hand, thin as paper now, found hers. You have shown me more gentleness in 3 weeks than they have shown me in 30 years. So I am going to ask you a foolish thing, and you may say no. Will you be my daughter? Just for one last day. Only so that, one time before I go, I can know what it feels like to have a child sit beside me because she wants to, and not because she is waiting for me to die. And the nurse, Obiageli Nwankwo, put down the cloth she was holding, and turned her face away from the dying man, and burst into tears. My people, he thought, those were the tears of a kind stranger, moved by a lonely old man's request. He was wrong. He had no idea, none at all, that he had just asked a woman to pretend to be the one thing she already was. Because before we talk about those tears, we must first talk about what was built, and about what a man can lose while he is busy building it. Chief Sir Godwin Uba was, by the time he lay dying in that vast, cold house in Asokoro, in Abuja, one of the richest men Nigeria had ever produced. Banking, construction, oil servicing. A tower with his name on it in Lagos and another in Abuja. When Godwin Uba entered a room, governors adjusted their wrappers. He had built an empire out of nothing, from a village boy with holes in his shoes to a man whose signature could move billions, and the whole country told the story of his rise as though it were something to sing about. And I will not pretend, my people, that there is nothing to admire in a man who climbs from holes in his shoes to a tower with his name on it. There is. But wealth is a strange country, and it has a border most people never notice they have crossed. On one side, money is a tool you use to build a life. On the other side, the money becomes the life, and the people in it slowly become tools. And you do not feel the moment you step across, because it feels, every single day, like winning. Godwin Uba won, and won, and won, for 40 years, and woke one morning at the end of it in the biggest house in Asokoro to discover he had won his way into a room with no one in it. That is not a fate that belongs only to billionaires, my people. It is only easier to see when the empty house is that large. But my people, every fortune has a price written somewhere on it, in ink the world prefers not to read. And the price of Godwin Uba's empire had been paid, decades ago, by a young woman whose name he had spent 40 years trying not to remember. Before the towers, before the title, before the Sir, Godwin was a poor clerk in Onitsha, and he loved a girl named Ncheta. Ncheta, the name means remembrance, my people, and hold that word because this whole story is going to turn on it. She was the daughter of a fish trader, poorer even than he was, and she loved that ambitious young clerk with her whole life. And she believed him when he said that one day he would be somebody, and that when he was, she would be his wife. Then Godwin got his first real chance. A wealthy man in Lagos offered to sponsor his rise, to open every door, on one condition, that Godwin marry into the sponsor's family, a girl of the right name and the right connections. And Godwin Uba, 24 years old and starving for the future, made the choice that would build his empire and hollow out his soul in the same afternoon. He took the deal. He left Ncheta. And he left her, my people, not knowing, or telling himself he did not know, that she was already carrying his child. Ncheta never chased him. She was too proud and too wounded, and she understood something about men in a hurry that it would take Godwin 50 years to learn about himself. She raised the child alone, in 2 rented rooms in Onitsha, sewing and trading and scrubbing, and she gave that child everything she had, and one thing more. She never once let the girl grow up hating her father. He was young, and he was poor, and fear makes people do terrible things, she would say. Do not carry his weakness as your own wound. Carry my love instead. It is heavier, and it will hold you better. And she did carry it, that love, and it did hold her. There is a picture of those 2-room years that Obi keeps in her mind, the way other people keep photographs. Her mother, home after a 14-hour day of trading and sewing, too tired to eat, sitting on the edge of the single bed to hear Obi recite her school lessons, because Ncheta had decided that whatever else poverty took from them, it would not take her daughter's future. A mother's attention, freely given at the end of an exhausting day, is the one wealth no landlord can seize. They had almost nothing. But Obi did not know they were poor until she was nearly grown, because her mother had filled those 2 rooms so completely with attention and dignity that there was simply no space left over for shame. That, my people, is a kind of provision that never shows up in any bank. It was the whole fortune Obi was raised on, and she will tell you to this day that she would not have traded it for every tower Godwin Uba ever built. That child grew up to be a nurse. That nurse was Obiageli. If you have ever been raised by one parent who carried the weight of 2 and did it without ever making you feel the absence as your fault, type "she carried it alone" in the comments, because somewhere out there is a Ncheta who deserves to be named tonight. And this whole story is, in the end, an attempt to name one. Obiageli, Obi, everyone called her, became exactly the kind of nurse the Ncheta who raised her would have been proud of. Private duty, palliative care, the hard and holy work of sitting with the dying. She was good at it in the way that cannot be taught in any school. She treated the frightened millionaire and the frightened market woman with the exact same tenderness. Because to Obi, a human being at the end was simply a human being at the end, and the size of the house made no difference to the size of the fear. Her mother, Ncheta, had died 3 years before this story begins, quietly, of the wearing out that poverty does to a body long before its time. But on one of her last clear evenings, Ncheta had done a thing she had never done in all the years before. She had told Obi her father's full name. Not with bitterness, with something closer to release. You should know where half of you comes from, she said. Chief Sir Godwin Uba, the big man in the newspapers, yes, that one. I am not telling you so that you go and knock on his gate. I am telling you because a person has the right to know their own beginning. What you do with it is yours. Obi did nothing with it. For 3 years, she did nothing with it because there was nothing to do. You do not walk up to an empire and announce yourself. The whole world would have called her exactly what the rich always call the children they abandoned. A gold digger, a liar, a scavenger. So she folded the name away and grieved her mother and went on nursing strangers. And then, my people, the nursing agency handed her a new assignment. A private palliative case. Terminal. A wealthy household in Asokoro. The patient's name on the folder was Chief Sir Godwin Uba. Now here, my people, is the first thing about Obi that tells you who she truly was. She sat with that folder in her lap for a long time. She could have refused it. Nurses decline cases. She could have said it was too far, too much, anything. And every reasonable instinct told her to refuse, because what good could come of nursing the man who threw her mother away? But another voice, quieter, spoke underneath the reasonable one. Not a voice of revenge, not even a voice of hope. Just this. I will never get another chance to look, once, at the man who made me, to see his face, to understand, maybe, the beginning my mother said I had the right to know. I will go, and I will do my job, and I will look at him once, and then I will leave, and he will never know, and that will be enough. That, my people, is not a gold digger.
Understand that clearly before we go one step further, because the vultures in this story are going to try very hard to convince a great many people otherwise. A gold digger comes to take. Obi came only to see. She walked into the richest man's deathbed wanting exactly nothing from him except the sight of his face. And that, it will turn out, is the one kind of person a man like Godwin Uba had never once had in his life. What she found in that grand, cold house shocked even her, and Obi had seen a great deal of how the rich die. She found a man dying almost entirely alone. Oh, there were people in the house, a son, Osita, and a daughter, Bianca, the two children of the marriage Godwin had traded his soul for. But they did not sit with their father. They sat with the lawyers. They moved through that mansion like people doing inventory, opening drawers, murmuring about the will, the shares, the Lagos Tower, the offshore accounts, taking phone calls in the corridor in which the only tender word was, soon. They came to their father's door to ask, through it, whether he had signed. They did not come through it to hold his hand. Obi heard them.
A dying room shares its walls with the rest of the house, and she heard Osita on the phone in the corridor telling someone the old man could go any day now, so we need the signatures locked before he does. And she heard Bianca ask the lawyer, in a bright hostess voice, whether the Lagos Tower could be moved out of the estate to avoid complications, before their father had even stopped breathing. My people, I have sat with a great many families around a great many deathbeds, and I have learned that death does not so much change people as reveal them. It turns the lights all the way up on who a person always quietly was. Some families gather at a bed and become, for a few holy days, better than they have ever been in their lives. And some gather and simply do their arithmetic a little louder, because the subject of the sum is finally almost gone. The Ubas were doing arithmetic. And the only person in that entire mansion who was doing love was the hired stranger they were paying by the shift. And there was old Pa Emmanuel, the steward, who had served Godwin Uba for 40 years, who loved the old man in the uncomplicated way of a servant who has grown into something like family. But a steward's love, in that house, was not counted as love at all. So the care of the dying billionaire fell, day after day, to the private nurse. And the private nurse, who had every reason on earth to give him only the cold minimum his money paid for, instead gave him the thing her mother had taught her to give. She gave him her full presence. She fed him when his hands failed. She read to him. She turned him gently so the bed sores would not take him before the illness could. She sat through his frightened nights, because the very rich, my people, are just as afraid of the dark at the end as the very poor. And money buys a bigger room to be afraid in, nothing more. There was one night in the second week when the fear took him badly, the way it comes for the dying in the small hours, when the house has gone silent and the mind stops pretending. He gripped Obi's hand and asked her, like a child, whether it would hurt, whether there was anything on the other side, whether a man who had done things he was not proud of could still hope for mercy at the end. And Obi, who had sat through this same terror with market women and mechanics, and now with a billionaire, told him the truth she had learned at 100 bedsides, that no one goes into that dark having been perfect, that mercy is not a wage you earn, but a gift you receive, and that a man who is finally truly sorry is already further along the road home than he dares to believe. He calmed under her voice, like a boat coming into harbor. He did not know he was being comforted by the very person his sin had wronged the most. He only knew that the fear loosened its grip when she spoke, and that in 80 years, no amount of money had ever once done that for him. She did not tell him who she was. What would have been the point? He was dying. To announce it would only have looked like a claim, a bid,
a scavenger arriving at the last moment. So she simply loved him, in secret, as a nurse, which was, though neither of them said it, also loving him as a daughter, which was the only way she had ever known how to love a father at all, from a distance, without being seen. If you have ever cared for someone, fully and gently, who never once cared for you the way they should have, type, "I still showed up," in the comments, because that is one of the hardest and most quietly heroic things a human being can do. And Obi was doing it for the very man whose absence had shaped her whole childhood. And slowly, over 3 weeks, the dying man came to depend on the nurse's presence the way a cold man depends on a small fire. He began to wait for her shifts. He talked to her, really talked, the way people do when the future has been taken off the table and only the truth is left. He told her about the village, about the holes in his shoes, about the towers. And once, in the gray middle of a bad night, he told her about a girl he had loved when he was young and poor, a girl named Ncheta, and how he had left her to marry money, and how he had spent 40 years being congratulated for the very decision that had, he now believed, quietly damned him. Obi sat in the dark and listened to her dying father describe abandoning her mother, and she did not say a word. And she did not let her face break because she was a professional, and because some griefs are too large to be spent in front of the person who caused them. She only reached out in the dark and held his hand a little tighter.
And Godwin Uba, who did not know he was holding his own daughter's hand while confessing the sin that made her, wept and said, "I have never told anyone that. Why am I telling you?" And Obi said softly, "Because I am easy to tell. I am nobody. Nobody's secret is unsafe with nobody." And he laughed weakly and said, "You are not nobody, nurse. You are the only somebody left in this house." It was the next morning that he asked her the question you heard at the start. "Will you be my daughter, just for one last day?" And she wept, because he was asking her to perform the truth, and then because she was her mother's child, and her mother had raised her to give love even where it had not been earned. She wiped her face, and she turned back to him, and she said yes. Let me tell you about that one last day, my people, because it was, in its own quiet way, the most expensive day in the whole life of a billionaire. And it did not cost 1 naira. She did not do anything grand. She could not. He was too weak, and grandness was never what he was really asking for. She simply spent the day being a daughter to a father. She opened the curtains and ascribed the morning to him. She played the old high-life records he loved, the ones from the Onitsha years, and watched something young come back into his ruined face. She fed him small spoons of the pepper soup Pa Emmanuel made specially, and she scolded him gently when he would not eat, the way a daughter scolds. And he obeyed, the way a father lets himself be scolded, delighted. She held his hand and called him Papa, the word cracking in her mouth in a way he mistook for tenderness and not for truth. And she watched the richest man in the room discover, on the last full day of his life, what the poorest child in a 2-room flat in Onitsha had always had. Someone who sat beside him because they wanted to, and not because they were waiting. In the afternoon of that last day, he asked her to bring him to the window. It took the 2 of them and Pa Emmanuel to move him to the chair, and it cost him nearly everything he had left. And he sat and looked out at the garden he had paid a fortune for and, he admitted quietly, had almost never once sat in. "I built all of this," he said, "and I lived in an office. I have a garden I never walked in, and children I never knew, and now a daughter for a day that I did not deserve." And Obi said nothing, because there was nothing to say that was kinder than her silence. And she simply stood beside his chair,
with her hand on his thin shoulder, and let him look at the garden, and let a man be sorry in the last of the light, without hurrying him through it. Grief needs to be witnessed, my people, not fixed. And Obi had spent her whole life learning the difference between the two. And here, my people, is the turn. And it did not come from a lawyer or a document. It came from a name. Late in that day, as the light went gold and then gray, Godwin drifted in the half-sleep of the dying, and he murmured, without opening his eyes, "Ncheta. I'm sorry, Ncheta." And Obi, worn down by the longest day of her life, her guard finally gone, answered him without thinking, in the voice she had used at her own mother's deathbed 3 years before. "It's all right. She forgave you. She told me so herself." The old man's eyes opened. "She told you," he said. Not a question. Something in his face had come suddenly, terribly awake. "How would Ncheta tell you anything, nurse? Ncheta has been gone from my life for 40 years. I do not even know if she is alive." And then his eyes moved over Obi's face. Really moved over it, feature by feature, the way a man reads a document he should have read decades ago. And Obi watched her father see her mother in her face, at last, in a last light of his last day. "What is your name?" he whispered. "Your full name. Your mother's name." And Obi, who had come only to see him once and leave, who had never meant to be seen at all, found that she could not lie to a dying man about the one thing that was true. "My name is Obiageli," she said. "Obiageli Nwankwo. My mother's name was Ncheta, and she raised me alone, and she died 3 years ago still telling me not to hate you." She was crying now, openly, the professional gone, only the daughter left. "I did not come here to take anything from you, Papa. I swear it on her grave. I came because I wanted to see your face one time. That is all. That is all I ever wanted." I want to stop the story here for one moment, my people, because I do not want you to rush past what actually happened in that room. We tell these stories, and we wait for the money. Who gets the towers? Who gets the accounts? I know. I feel it too. But what passed between that man and that woman in the last light of that day was worth more than every tower he ever built, and no court could weigh it. It had been given to him freely by the very child he had thrown away before she was born, who owed him nothing and came bearing only gentleness. Ncheta had raised her daughter well, and Ncheta's forgiveness, spoken through her daughter's mouth, reached the man who abandoned her one full day before it was too late. Godwin Uba did not get to make things right in the grand way rich men imagine they will. He had one night left, and he knew it. But a man can do a great deal in one night if he stops lying at last. He sent, that very evening, for his oldest and most trusted lawyer, not the ones his children had been hovering with, but the one man who had drawn his real documents for 30 years. And behind a closed door, with Pa Emmanuel as witness, Godwin Uba spent the last strength of his life doing the only honest accounting he had ever done. He died before dawn, with his daughter holding one hand and his old steward holding the other, and not one of his legitimate waiting children in the room, because they had gone home to sleep, confident there was nothing left to do but collect. My people, they were so wrong. The reading of the will was held in the grand parlor, and Osita and Bianca arrived dressed for a coronation. They had already in their heads divided the empire, and the family lawyer, the real one, the honest one, read out an instrument that Godwin Uba had, it turned out, quietly begun preparing weeks before. In the long nights the nurse sat beside him, and finished on the last night of his life. The bulk of the fortune, The towers, the shares, the vast accounts. Chief Sir Godwin Uba left not to his children, and not, my people, to the nurse either. He left it to a foundation to build and run hospitals for the poor across the East, in the towns where women like Ncheta die of the wearing out long before their time, for want of the care that money could have bought them. And he names that foundation, in his own dying hand, the Ncheta Foundation. Remembrance. He built, with the empire he had traded her love to create, a monument of mercy in the name of the woman he had wronged, so that her name, which he had spent 40 years trying to forget, would now be spoken with gratitude in 100 towns for 100 years, over the beds of the poor, forever.
Sit with the size of that for a moment, my people. A man had traded a woman's love for a fortune when he was young, and at the very end he took that entire fortune, every naira he had gained by leaving her, and turned it into her memorial, into mercy poured out in her name over exactly the kind of poor and forgotten women she had been. He could not give Ncheta back her life, or her wedding, or the 40 years. But he could make certain that the name he had tried so hard to bury would outlive him, and outlive his towers, spoken with thanks by strangers for generations. It was not enough, and he knew it. And that, my people, is the whole nature of real penance. It arrives knowing it is far too late, and it does the right thing anyway, not to erase the wrong which cannot be erased, but to stop, at last, being the kind of man who did it. Too late is still better than never. Not as good as in time, but better than never. And for Godwin Uba, one day of better than never was all that remained. And to his small, belated credit, he took it with both failing hands. To Osita and Bianca he left enough to live on, and not 1 naira more, with a letter, read aloud, that I will carry with me a long time. I gave you everything money can buy, it said, and I see now that in doing so, I taught you to value nothing else. And that is my failure before it was ever yours. I am leaving you less, not to punish you, but because I have finally understood that the money was never the inheritance. The way you sat outside my door counting, that was the inheritance I actually gave you, and I am ashamed of it. I pray you outgrow it. You will have a better chance of becoming real people without a fortune to hide behind. And to Obiageli Nwankwo, his daughter, named as his daughter, plainly, in the document, acknowledged at last. He left almost no money at all. He left her a letter, and a single old photograph of a girl named Ncheta, laughing in Onitsha in 1979. And a role, if she wanted it, and only if she wanted it. A seat on the board of the foundation that bore her mother's name, so that the hospitals would be run by someone who actually knew what it was to be poor and afraid and sick and unseen. Now here, my people, is the second turn, and it is the ugly one, because grief and greed together make people do monstrous things. Osita Uba could not bear it. Not the losing of the fortune, or not only that, but the losing of it to a foundation named for a stranger, and the sudden appearance of a nurse the will called his sister. And so he did what small, cornered, entitled people do. He reached for the nastiest weapon in the house. He went to the police, and to the newspapers, and he accused the nurse. He said she was a fraud who had wormed her way into a dying man's confidence, that she had manipulated a sick old man, isolated him, poisoned him against his true children, perhaps even hastened his death. That this so-called daughter was a scheming gold digger who had forged her way into a fortune. He had money and rage and a famous name, and for a few terrible weeks the story he told was the story the whole country heard. My people, notice what he chose to attack. Not her claim, her character, because that is always the first move of the guilty against the good.
If you cannot deny that a person did something kind, you must invent a filthy reason for the kindness, so that you do not have to feel the weight of your own coldness beside it. Osita could not stand in the light of what Obi had done, so he tried to drag her down into the dark where he already lived, on the ancient, cowardly principle that if everyone is dirty, no one has to be ashamed. But here is what Osita, in all his rage, had forgotten. Godwin Uba had died lying, for once, only to strangers. To his lawyer and his steward, on that last night, he had told the whole truth, and being a man who had built an empire on paper, he had done the one thing that would protect his daughter after he was gone. He had recorded it. A statement, filmed by his own lawyer at his own insistence, weak but lucid, in which Chief Sir Godwin Uba named Obiageli as his daughter, told the story of Ncheta plainly, stated for the record that the nurse had never asked him for a single thing, that he had had to force even the letter and the photograph upon her, that she had in fact tried to refuse any place at all, and that if anyone ever accused her of manipulating him, they should be shown this film and made to sit with their shame. They were shown the film, and a DNA test which Obi herself quietly requested, not to claim the fortune she had already refused, but simply to clear her mother's name of the word liar, confirmed what her face had already told a dying man in the last gold light of his last day.
The story turned, the way stories do once the truth finally gets its shoes on. The nurse who had been called a scavenger was revealed as the one person in that whole family who had wanted nothing and given everything. And Osita Uba, who had gone to the newspapers to destroy his own sister, found that the mud he threw so hard had a way of sliding back down the wall and settling permanently on the man who threw it. He was not jailed, but in the drawing rooms of Abuja and Lagos, in the papers that had printed his accusations and now printed their retraction, his name became a particular kind of byword. The rich man's son who tried to ruin the nurse who sat with his father when he would not. Some sentences, my people, are served entirely in public, one raised eyebrow at a time, for the rest of a life. And Obi? Here is the third thing about her, the one that makes her great and not merely wronged. She still refused the money. Understand me, my people. She could have fought for a share of that empire, and with the will and the DNA and the film, she would likely have won something. The whole country would have understood. Instead, Obiageli Nwankwo did the thing that separates the people who were owed from the people who are free. She took the letter. She took the photograph of her laughing young mother, and she took the one seat on the Ncheta Foundation board. Not for the money, for there was no fortune in it for her, only work. Because it let her spend the rest of her life doing the thing she was already doing, sitting beside the frightened and the sick and the unseen, except now with hospitals behind her instead of only her own two hands. She did not want her father's empire. She had never wanted his empire. She had come to that house wanting to see his face one time, and she left it having been called his daughter, having forgiven him with her mother's own words, having buried him with her hand in his. That was the whole inheritance she had ever been after, and she had received every last bit of it. She did not forget old Pa Emmanuel, the steward who held the old man's other hand at the end, who had witnessed the truth on the last night and never once wavered when the powerful son tried to bury it. When the dust settled, Obi made sure the faithful old man, whom the will had remembered modestly, would never work another day he did not choose to. And she visited him and sat with him, because he too had loved Godwin Uba for nothing. And people who love for nothing are the rarest wealth this world contains. And Obi had been raised by one, and knew exactly what they are worth. Today there are hospitals rising in the towns of the East with one word over their gates: Ncheta, remembrance.
In them, poor women who would once have died of the wearing out, quietly, unseen, the way Obi's mother died, are cared for and live. Every one of them is a monument to a young girl who was abandoned in Onitsha in 1979 and never got her wedding, but who raised a daughter so well that the daughter's goodness reached back across 40 years and reshaped the conscience of the very man who wronged her, one day before he died. That, my people, is what a good mother's love can do, long after the mother is gone. It does not die with her. It keeps working. If this story reached somewhere real in you tonight, if you have ever loved without being loved back, or shown up for someone who did not deserve it, or been called a schemer for simply being kind, then do not leave this family without joining it first. Subscribe now, so the next story finds you the very night it lands. And tell me in the comments, what city, what country is this story reaching you in tonight? From Lagos to London, from Accra to Atlanta, from Nairobi to New York, from Onitsha to Ontario. I want to see just how far this one has traveled. And do not go yet, because there is already another story waiting for you right there on your screen right now. Another quiet soul the powerful decided was nothing. Another account, long overdue, finally settled in the light. Because here is the truth I want you to carry home with you tonight, longer than any name in this story. A man can spend his whole life buying every room in the grandest house and discover, on the last night of it, that he never once owned the only chair that mattered, the one someone sits in beside you, for no reason but love. Money can buy every kind of company except the kind that would still be there if the money were gone. And when you finally lie down at the end, my people, the only wealth that will lean over your bed and hold your hand is the wealth you gave away for free years ago to people who could do nothing for you in return.
Godwin Uba learned that one day before the end. Learn it tonight, while there is still a whole life left to spend it in. Until next time, my people, be gentle with the ones who can do nothing for you. One of them may turn out to be the only family you had left. And never, ever mistake the person who wants nothing from you for the person who is worth nothing to you. They are, so often, the exact opposite.